Like me, the tatted up Reformed Baptist interviewing my Mennonite father-in-law. Welcome back to Odyssey. Today we're starting a new series where I interview people from all different kinds of theological backgrounds. And the very first group we're going to be talking about is the Mennonites. What do they believe? We're sitting here in a Mennonite church, and I'm sitting next to not just my father-in-law, but also a Mennonite elder. So stay tuned to watch. My first question for you is, how did you become a Mennonite? Because you weren't always a Mennonite, right?
Yes. We did not grow up Mennonite. I guess for me, it really started years ago. I grew up in a Pentecostal church. And so when I met your mother-in-law, my wife, Abby, she was attending a church where the pastor's wife, she would have grown up in Anabaptist circles and would have worn a covering on her head. And so when we were getting married, Abby just really wanted me to look at that. And of course, the churches I grew up in, they would have really taken that passage there, 1 Corinthians 11, verses 1 through 16. And they would have really settled on verse 15 as kind of being the only point of significance really in that passage. And would have drawn the conclusion that all it's really prescribing is that women shouldn't cut their hair. I grew up hearing this my whole life. And so it took a bit to kind of get out of that. I think most people, when they grow up, whatever church you grow up in, you probably see a lot of things and hear a lot of things. And the things that you see and hear in a church, whether you're consciously evaluating it or not, at some point your subconscious mind is keeping score of the things that strike you as being, this is very biblical, or this is really reflective of God's revelation of himself, or this is very consistent with the character of Christ. These are things that, you're keeping score, like, oh yeah, this makes sense. This is, God calls us to do this. This is just what he's talking about here in this passage. And, and then of course you run into some things that, pardon my throat, that don't always strike you the same way, and maybe are kind of the opposite. And for me, that was really kind of the first thing that hit me is, this doesn't really seem to make me feel comfortable,
Right.
Where my church is coming out on this, and prayed about it. And of course we changed the way we were doing things. And
How old are you?
I was, I was in my early 20s, 95, 24.
My age.
Yeah, your age. And of course, Sappy was a little younger yet.
Yeah.
Here we were the only people, a church of, 200-300 people. We're the only people that are doing this. And so
That's in a Pentecostal church.
in this Pentecostal church, yes. Skipping for the sake of time quite a bit, but we kind of looking for a place where it felt like, could we find a place that fits a little better? And I think one of the things I'm hoping to convey to on YouTube, I think is where it's going. Yes, on your YouTube channel. But one of the things I hope to convey is, it's really common for folks to encounter things, and they really struggle with this question of, do I stay or do I go?
Mhm.
Does it matter enough to me to care about it?
Mm-hmm.
And if it does, what am I going to do about it?
Yeah.
Do I stay here and try to address those things, to have a dialogue and promote some sort of change that's more reflective of what God reveals of himself in his word, and then what he says to us about how we ought to live? Or do I go somewhere else where they're already, all these things that I have questions about or concerns about, they've addressed those in a way that I'm very comfortable with.
And at this time, it's still head coverings for you?
And at this time, it's still head coverings for
Right.
me. I mean, there were some, kind of some other things, but that was really the thing that stood out like a sore thumb, so to speak, is that, we just look different than everybody. So, yeah.
So at what point would you have said you became like full-fledged Mennonite, not just like I'm good on head coverings, but even more specifically like the other things related to like nonviolence? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think those were things that we pretty much really already had
Okay.
over the years. Just you mentioned nonviolence or non-resistance. I really always felt growing up, it didn't hit me right to think that if somebody were to, and this could be quite offensive to some people, I'm sure it is often quite offensive to folks, but I never really felt comfortable, like, if someone's going to break into my house and they're going to steal things from me, or even do harm to me and my family, it just doesn't quite feel right as a Christian, someone knows Jesus Christ, kind of planning that, preparations being made and planning that if somebody comes into my home, the worst thing that they can do to me is send me to be in the presence of Jesus.
Mm.
And if I respond to them with violence, and particularly if I respond to them with something that can cause the loss of life, which is typically the default that folks seem to go to, do I really feel comfortable sending someone into eternity unprepared to meet God, knowing that the worst thing that they could do would be to send me to be with Him forever? And so for me, that was just me. That was the struggle I had, that had me very much on the same page before I knew what non-resistance was. Jesus calls us to love and to suffer, particularly, and not to get ahead of ourselves, but the Sermon on the Mount, some of the things that Jesus said,
Mm.
and even the way of our human nature, He sets things on its head, and He calls us to do things that go so contrary to our initial impulse and our gut response to how we should protect ourselves or protect what we want. And even you look at the apostles, they didn't go around going to great lengths to defend themselves, but they rejoiced that they were kind of worthy to suffer for Christ's sake. I tend to ramble, so you may have to rein me in a little bit here and there. But
We're on question one
we're on
of
question one,
14.
14. You look at early church history, and truly, as is said of different time periods, but the blood of the martyrs was the seed that grew the church.
Mm.
People willing to lay down their lives because they so firmly believed what Jesus taught that they were willing to let this natural life and the things that we are so naturally inclined to cling to let those things go, knowing that eternity with Jesus Christ was going to redeem anything that they might suffer in this life, and that it was worth it. So I hope I answered that follow-up question about non-resistance.
I think so.
Yeah.
So you were talking about church history, the blood of the martyrs, sea of the church. My next question for you is so you gave your own history. What is the history of both Anabaptists as well as Mennonites? Because the understanding is like there's the umbrella of what makes someone an Anabaptist, but then underneath that, and I don't want to speak on your behalf, I want you to say this, but you have your Mennonites over here, Amish over here, Hutterite over here, and then there's all different kinds of flavors in between. So talk about the history of that.
Sure. Here we are, we're in 2025.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually the 500-year anniversary of the birth of Anabaptism. And Anabaptist, most folks listening may or may not know this. The word literally means to baptize again or rebaptize, because one of the most significant things that they did at the birth of the Anabaptist movement would have been to rebaptize adults who have been baptized as infants. Here they are. It's 1525. They're in Zurich. These are people who they've been working with Ulrich Zwingli and his movement, Protestant Reformation, trying to reform from things that they perceive to be, again, concerning. We talked a little bit about, in your church, you find things that are concerning or discordant. They don't seem quite right. They don't seem quite consistent. And so that's what the reformers were doing. They were looking at things in the Roman Catholic Church, things that didn't seem consistent with the character of Christ. As this group with Zwingli was kind of working through some things, they wanted to go farther, faster than Zwingli and the Council of Zurich.
And what were those things that they wanted to do faster?
Well, there is a list, but things that they were really specifically concerned about were things like the separation of church and state. The Roman Catholic Church, a lot of the things that the reformers were really concerned about, directly or indirectly, kind of tie back to the Roman Catholic Church's pursuit of temporal power, which at that time was in full swing. You had the Crusades and things like that, and that day they were selling indulgences to basically finance, trying to exert influence and control over people, the people in their churches. These things of like having the church and the state married, and there's a name for that escapes me that I'm sure you never have to top your head. But these types of churches where you kind of marry the church and the state together.
Sacralism.
Yeah, thank you. Sacralism. And they were seeing that these radical reformers were seeing that play out in Zurich, where the council was really dragging its feet on some of the things that even Zwingli was saying, these things need to be changed. I think they kind of despaired that change would ever come. On that day, it was January the 21st in 1525, the Council of Zurich had met with Zwingli, and they actually had issued some sort of decree or proclamation that these more radical people in this group of reformers, they were basically not going to be allowed to talk about their beliefs and to teach the things that they were concerned about. That very day, 12 to 15 men that would have met, depending on which version of the story you read. Some people say a dozen, some others say, 3 well-known men plus, a dozen more. But they would have met in the home of a man named Felix Manz, whose name will come up here in a bit. But they decided they were going to move forward and they were going to make a break with the Swiss Brethren that Zwingli was the leader of. One of the men baptized another, and then he would have baptized the rest of them. And of course, they would have been baptized as infants. And, I've circled all the way around. I just said church and state, but there were a number of other things that they were concerned about. One of them was baptizing the infants, people being in the church, being considered a part of the church, members of the church, however you want to parse that, but being in the church, but not really being believers, not really having been converted. Things like this were kind of their concerns. And again, that marriage of church and state stopped the church collecting, tithes, which were essentially taxes from the government. Right. Break those connections between the government and the church, and let the church be free to follow Christ, and let the government be free to do its role in basically promoting an environment that's orderly and safe for people to live lives, hopefully following Jesus Christ.
Right. And so that was how its birth happened, of just generically Anabaptist.
Yeah.
And then my understanding is that's when persecution starts, not even initially from Roman Catholics, but actually from the Reform movement in Zurich under Zwingli, right?
Yes, and that's one of the more remarkable things is within 2 years, actually slightly less than, it was in January of 1527. Felix Manz was actually the first martyr, not the first Anabaptist martyr, period, but the first Anabaptist martyr to have been killed by Protestants.
Hmm.
Zurich would have been the place where the persecution first came from. They were the first ones to put Anabaptists to death. They typically would kill them by drowning. Actually,
Right.
The Protestants would, and particularly with Zurich and Zwingli, they would have drowned them and referred to it as their third baptism,
Mhm.
almost mockingly.
Yeah.
Within a couple of years after the death of Felix Manz, but early in 1527, there would have been some meetings with some groups that set down a confession of faith.
Yeah.
And we know it as the Schleitheim Confession. 7 points. It's very, very straightforward, very, very, very short. It's not like your, Westminster Confession of Faith where it's just on and on and on.
Mhm.
But, 7 points, very straightforward, spelling out what was going to make the Anabaptists different than the other groups that were going on at that time. And Michael Sattler would have been really a primary leader of that effort. He was another person who was martyred for his Anabaptism. A little farther on in history, within about 10, 12 years, you've got Menno Simons, who
Mhm.
Mennonites are actually, the name comes from Menno Simons.
And what date is that about?
He was converted, I think it was 1536 with
Okay.
his conversion.
So he was formerly Catholic, not Reformed or okay.
Correct. He was Roman Catholic, would have joined with the Anabaptists, and of course, at some point after that, he was really influential in formalizing and contextualizing some things, and just doing a better job of really taking the teachings of Anabaptism into something that folks could really interact with. But
All right.
so that's really probably the thing that Menno Simons is most known for. He's got some really significant quotes that are out there. It's lengthy, and I don't have it in front of me, but for those of you who want to Google Menno Simons and true evangelical faith, he has a really really beautiful quote about true evangelical faith and what it calls us to do. That really, I think, reflects the message of Anabaptists in a real profound way, and Mennonites. You mentioned the Hutterites and the Amish. Jacob Hutter would have been somebody who he actually passed away in 1536. So about the time Menno Simons joined the Anabaptist movement, Jacob Hutter would have passed away, but he had promoted a real emphasis on communal living and having, things in common as they did in Acts. People would just take the resources and make them available to the church for the needs of the church. And so Jacob Hutter would have had that as something really important to him. And so the Hutterites would have came really from that, his emphasis on that. But that was kind of the first splitting out of a group off of there. And so Hutterites, there are communities in the United States. A lot of them are kind of in the northern part of the Midwest and out west, but
Yeah.
they have these oh, what's the word?
It's like a colony?
Colony,
Okay.
thank you. Yeah, colonies that they would have, that they basically have they pull their resources, and the property is all owned by the, the community. And so uh, they would still exist today, and you can find them,
Hmm.
if you go looking for them. But, the Hutterites, other than the real emphasis on communal living, they are a lot like Mennonites.
Okay.
Um, uh, the Amish would have actually come from, Jacob, and I'm struck with his last name. There's I think it's Ammon, but
Right.
that there are different ways that if you look at it, that it might occur to you to pronounce it. He would have come along, later yet, and he would have, kind of been the driving force in the Amish splitting off from the, at that time they were being called Mennonites. Um,
When did the term Mennonite come in?
it would have been during, I think, during the life of Menno Simons,
Okay.
or shortly after his death. It wouldn't have been, very far into the movement. I mean, when you have, much like the early church, when you have people that are constantly being put to death, it really accelerates kind of your timeline of people rising to prominence, and a lot of change happening, as well. But, Mennonites, yeah, probably. I don't know that I know the date, but we're probably talking middle of the 16th century. There, 1560, maybe something
Okay.
like that would be my guess.
So initially, Anabaptist and Mennonite became synonymous terms.
They did. They
And
became synonymous terms.
and when did the Hutterites, do we understand it as the Hutterites split off from the Mennonites then?
They did. Actually, before they were even known as Mennonites.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so at some point during Jacob Hutter's, life, they would have kinda already been split
Okay,
off.
okay.
So, at some point just prior to 1535.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And then the Amish split off even later.
Even later, yeah.
Okay.
And their emphasis was really, as I understand it, was around, wanting to, take a little bit of a different stance on, church discipline would probably be the biggest thing, that I'm aware of. Although, here we are a few hundred years later. Really, the things that Amish are known for in the world today are being the people who are, really concerned and careful about how they use technology and allow technology to kind of influence their life.
Yeah.
So they're the ones that, rather than driving automobiles, they're still going around in horses and buggies, and some of them probably have, carry cell phones now. Probably a lot of them carry cell phones now, but,
Mhm.
I know years ago, we knew folks that they had essentially a telephone booth in their yard because they weren't allowed to have a telephone in their home.
These are Amish.
These are Amish.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. A lot of the Amish and Mennonites today, even if you go out, I did look at what the internet had to say about some things, preparing for questions I anticipated today, but, in some of those cases, they still group the Amish. They consider the Amish to be Mennonites.
Okay.
When you're reading the internet, but the Mennonites and the Amish, they don't,
Yeah.
they don't generally, yeah.
So I guess that can move us into the next question. Um, I'm gonna kinda break down this question into 3 smaller questions. One is, can you give me an overview of what Mennonites believe? Could you also, here are the other 2, like, kinda micro questions as part of it. What are misconceptions about Mennonites, that people may have? So a lot of people think that Mennonite is just another branch of Amish, and there are a lot of connotations of Amish, which is like, riding the buggy, and things like that. And then third of all, what makes Mennonites distinct from Amish and Hutterites?
Well, I think Mennonites are fairly orthodox on the things that would be the essentials of the faith. We believe, we believe in God. We very much believe, in the Bible as God's word. We preach Jesus Christ. We seek to follow. I think a big emphasis of Mennonites would be trying to just practically live out the things that we believe. In particular, I think the Sermon on the Mount is super significant, especially to Mennonites and probably all Anabaptist folks. But and so the emphasis, really, a big emphasis, is living out our faith in ways that maybe aren't always easy or obvious, but living out our faith in a way that reflects what we're called to in Scripture, and also is something that, of course, brings glory to God. As far as, we believe in the Trinity. I know some folks don't. They wouldn't you like the word Trinity because it's not in the Bible,
Okay.
but they would prefer the Godhead.
So I guess when I say overview, not so much as like you would say, like, when it comes to what people think of like Protestant orthodoxy. Now you've said before, like an Anabaptist group wouldn't want to consider itself Protestant, but like more so, what are the distinctives? So
Sure.
so beyond like Trinity salvation.
I don't know if it's as much a theological difference as a practical difference, but Mennonites and most Anabaptists, although I will say in the last couple of elections, things have kind of changed, but with at least some groups, you see a lot of like Amish people voting in the last couple of ads, in Pennsylvania in particular. Apparently, historically, they've been very much about that, separation of church and state, and trying to really focus on building Christ's kingdom rather than getting entangled with kingdoms of the world. And so hopefully that frees us to be really faithful in following Jesus Christ and not giving the people around us that we're trying to be a witness to and trying to share the gospel with, kind of mixed messages about what's important to us.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So there's a very harsh distinction in the Anabaptist mind of like living for Christ and it's intermingling with civil government.
Yeah, there's a very clear line there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, in recent years, it seems as though at least some parts of the larger Anabaptist movement have kind of drifting away from that a little bit.
Yeah.
A significant event which we didn't talk about earlier in the history part, but there was a town, Munster. If you look for the Munster Rebellion, it was a rather significant event. It would have come after the Schleitheim Confession, which would have said in that that the sword exists outside the perfection of Christ, is part of the Schleitheim Confession. While we acknowledge the government's right, and not just right to be involved in bearing the sword and in keeping order, but we would very much feel like it's ordained by God that the government do that. But we're called to build Christ's kingdom and not get involved in those other things.
So real quick, so you would say like Mennonites would believe that Christians ought not be part of the government?
There's a spectrum, very much a spectrum, as with most of the groups when you're talking about Protestant groups.
Yes.
A while back, but there's a spectrum. You have some that would consider themselves, they would call themselves Mennonite, and they would be, of course, very, very liberal, and including some things you talked about with ordaining women, and even ordaining homosexuals to be in ministry in their churches. And so you have that extreme of the spectrum, and then they're even more conservative than we would be here at our church. We're an unaffiliated church, but there are conferences that are more conservative than us in terms of prescribing dress and things like that. In the spectrum, we're probably, I would call us moderately conservative, but in that you're going to find kind of in our area of the spectrum, very consistent that we want the things that our neighbors interact with us to be about Christ and not about some other pursuit. Things like who becomes president of the United States to be something that creates a barrier to people hearing the gospel from us.
Okay.
And so I know that's probably very uncomfortable, and perhaps is going to incite some comments on this video, that there are a lot of folks that really don't care for non-participation and also for the nonviolence.
Yes.
I've been on social media for quite a while, and I've had some unfortunate interactions with folks that did not care for that, and yet we feel like that's what Christ calls us to, and so that's how we choose to.
And now, so my wife is your daughter, not was your daughter, is your daughter. And she is no longer Mennonite. So I'm a Reformed Baptist, and so is she. And so that's a fairly fun like me, the tatted up Reformed Baptist interviewing my Mennonite father-in-law. But what she has basically told me is that the term pacifism is somewhat of an offensive term in some Mennonite circles.
It's some, yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I think one of the reasons is because pacifism, it tends to have a different focus a lot of times, and you'll see, people, and of course, probably the more liberal spectrum of Mennonites would prefer pacifism to non-resistance, as how you described them. But by and large, pacifism tends to be, it's something that's a little more political in nature, and it's a little more engaging with the world, and kind of say trying to kind of manipulate or coerce the government or the world around us to do what I want, which pacifism, I think, is essentially very similar to non-resistance as far as the goal of not doing violence.
Yeah.
And yet the means and the methods for trying to promote that, pacifism tends to be more about trying to make other people live up to my standard on violence or nonviolence.
Okay, I see.
Where non-resistance would be folks that they prefer non-resistance is because it really is more about a stance that we take. We choose to turn the other cheek. We choose to suffer for Christ.
Yeah.
And we trust that we can rejoice that we are found worthy to suffer for His name.
Okay. So what I'm hearing so far for overview of the beliefs, so non-aggression, non-participation, and credo baptism, so believer's baptism as opposed to infant baptism, probably like one of the things that my understanding is what the reformers found most offensive at the time. And then there's also this aspect of can you just talk about women? Like, because there's more to it than head coverings, right? So it also involves jewelry. It also involves like the type of clothes being worn. Like, kind of talk about like that Anabaptist or Mennonite perspective.
Sure. Well, again, there's a spectrum, and I think if you go towards the more liberal end of the spectrum, there's not going to be any prescriptions that are any different than folks that aren't even going to church anywhere.
Yeah.
But I think in our circles, the moderate conservative Mennonite churches, there is going to be an emphasis on covering the head for the women and uncovering the head for men when they're involved in praying, prophesying, being in church, and because we don't really know, and this, sorry, a little bit of trouble, because we don't really know when we're going to be called upon to pray. Generally, most Mennonite women are going to actually cover their heads pretty much from getting up in the morning until going to bed at 9, and sometimes even more. Some would actually cover through the night, but because they want to be in that place when they need to pray in the moment that their heads are covered to honor God, as Paul says. Generally, the majority of Mennonites are going to be very conservative in dress. They're going to be looking for modest clothing. The more conservative you go, you might have really strict prescriptions in certain churches and certain conferences about the style of the covering, the shape of the covering, what material it's made out of, whether or not it has
like tassels. Yeah. Okay.
Those kind of things. I mean, those are all in certain churches. Those are all prescribed and very important to unity and having kind of a consistent appearance to the community. Our church isn't. We have actually in our church probably 4 or 5 or 6 different styles of veils that women wear, and so we aren't that conservative that we have a prescription on that. And, some would require a certain style of dress. If you've ever heard of a cape dress, it's made in such a way to have basically an extra piece of fabric that would go over the upper body for modesty. But some churches require cape dresses. Some churches would require, quite a bit more as far as colors of fabric in the clothing, and whether or not it can have patterns. And what those patterns can be, flowers, and can the flowers be this large or any larger, or just, there's quite a bit that matter to certain groups.
And I've heard that can cause even a split in the church.
I think it probably can.
Yeah.
Those things can divide folks, but the thing is that there's, as you said the other day, there are a lot of different Mennonite churches. There are large communities of Anabaptists where they're Amish and Mennonite, and in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and in Indiana and other states. And so in these large communities, you're going to find a lot of different churches. And so you can almost, whatever approach you want to take to how invested you want to be in a uniformity of dress and what that uniformity becomes. You can find a church that's going to kind of fit. I mean, as far as you want to go, you can find churches there. They don't say anything about what you wear. And
So, are there any other like more distinctives that belong to the Mennonite belief?
I do think the things that we do, and this is something that maybe sets me as a new Mennonite, a first generation Mennonite, but I do think that the things that we do that are different than the world should be something that points to Christ. And I don't think, and not to be offensive to folks who take a different stance, but I don't think that the things that we do should just be, strange or odd for no particular reason. If it doesn't in one way or another point to Christ and obedience to Christ,
Right.
I think it is just as much a mixed message as preaching the gospel to folks and living distinctive lives and having, signs for who's running for president in our yard. Or going out in the community and passing out, door to door, passing out buttons for somebody who's running for president.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And now you've touched on it slightly with the whole colonies thing, but again, like what are like, how are Amish and Hutterites different from Mennonites?
Well, the Amish, the biggest difference probably is the technology issue. They also,
so you guys can have Wi-Fi and Nintendo Switches and all kinds of things. Yeah. Okay.
We can drive cars. We can do, and we're depending on and this is a bit complicated, but the Amish are organized by districts, and so in your district you have bishops, and they're going to be the ones that basically decide in your district whether or not you can have this technology in your home or in your business, whether you can have whether you're allowed to have a telephone booth in your yard or not.
Okay.
Is something that would be governed by the district, and the bishop would be the ones deciding those things for you, and whether or not with your shop, can you use a tractor? Do you have to have these large horses pulling wagons and things? Can you use tractors, and what kind of tractors? Can your tractors have inflatable tires on them, or do they have to have metal wheels? These are different things that the Amish people, they would kind of have their own, again, each district would have their own stance on, would take, much like every, Mennonite church in Davis County is going to have their own stance on things like how specific are they with prescribing, dress. So that's probably the biggest difference that's obvious to people. They also would have church, actually, the Amish would have church every other week, as opposed to more, because of course it's a big undertaking to gather all those people together with buggies at somebody's house. And they would meet in homes of their members, as opposed to going to a specific building for church.
Gotcha. Yeah. So as someone who converted to becoming a Mennonite, what were some things that you saw were just the biggest changes or adjustments you had to make? Because I assume, like, talking about like your initial reason for converting, like, were there some things once you joined the church where like, okay, so I got to get a handle on this? Or
honestly, there weren't that many things from like a theological perspective. I think honestly the biggest thing for me was, you look at our church, there are no musical instruments in the church.
Right.
And so I grew up in as many people did, in churches where you have musicians playing accompaniment, and of course we pick up our hymnal and we sing out of the hymnal. And largely people are singing the melody line. And the accompaniment is giving you the harmony notes. Where in our church we would have our songbooks. We have the church hymnal, the Songs of Faith and Praise are the two books we have. The church hymnal would be older songs. Songs of Faith and Praise will actually have songs as recent as 20, 25, 30 years ago in it. But our books have notation in shape notes, 4-part harmony, and so you come here and we have a cappella singing, and so coming in the door and this beautiful. Of course, this church is wonderful acoustically. Not all churches are like this, but this church has wonderful acoustics for singing. So that was probably for me, and that was probably the biggest thing, was getting accustomed to the music. A lot of the songs I sang growing up in the Pentecost church are songs that we sing in this church as well.
Interesting.
There's something about that, just beautiful 4-part a cappella. It's really it's wonderful. It's moving. Yeah.
So, this kind of gets into a separate question, but given how we're doing on time, I'll probably jump around and hit some of the big questions. But this does kind of move into a question I was going to ask you later. What does Mennonite worship look like? So like corporate worship. You talked about how there's no instruments, it's all a cappella. Is that like a conscientious theological decision, like what you would have in like really strict Presbyterian or Reformed principles of like the regulative principle of worship, where they would argue that there's no New Testament command to have instruments? Like, is it a similar thing, or is it a different reason?
Yeah, and I would say not all Mennonite churches wouldn't have instruments.
Okay.
I think probably the more conservative ones would be without instruments, though.
Okay.
And I don't know that they would articulate it as the regulative principle. But I think a lot of the logic for it has been that argument that there's not really any mention of using instruments in the New Testament, and actually, some folks tend to think that using instruments was probably not real common in the early church, just because of the noise factor of attracting attention when you're people that are being persecuted for your faith, and
right.
Your life was on the line by name in the name of Christ. They probably didn't do that. It's just a choice that this church made before we were here.
Yeah,
and we feel comfortable with that.
Gotcha. So is there any other specifics to what goes on in a Mennonite corporate worship service?
I mean, when you come in on a Sunday morning, we would come in, we would sing some songs, a cappella, sing some songs, and as in most churches, somebody's going to get up and they're going to have kind of an opening and an intro to the Sunday school class and dismiss the Sunday school classes. And then we do Sunday school and we come back together. And in our church, we have, the children get up in the corner over there, and they would sing some songs. Usually a couple songs to get us going. But then we move into what we call sharing time. And it's a really beautiful time where it's kind of reflective in some ways of what Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 14, where he talks about what their church services were like. And of course, there's a little bit of a different message going through that as well. But that emphasis there in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 25, 26, where, he asks, how is it then when you come together? And everybody comes together. Essentially, they come prepared to share something, to challenge or to encourage the church, to speak to what is God saying to them, what is God calling them to, or calling us to have folks, coming in and sharing their heart, what's going on in their week, or a song that spoke to them this past week, things that are going on, and just, sharing the scripture and a thought on that. And it's a really wonderful time. And I think it's a real example of what the writer of Hebrews says there in the second part of Hebrews 10:25, the part that no one seems to remember. It isn't just showing up, but it's actually, as Paul continues on, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see it approaching. Right. And so it's that opportunity for folks to encourage and exhort one another to be faithful in following Christ.
Yeah.
About 6 months after we first visited here, we were here for a service after there'd been a tent revival in the community. And the sharing time that morning was just, folks were standing up and they were talking about how God had just challenged their heart the previous week, and things that they felt like they could do better at, and even confession of some failings in their walk. And just really open about what God was saying to them and how they wanted to be faithful in serving the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that was the morning. That's literally the morning where we're driving home. And of course, we drive, over half hour each way when the river's not flooded, as it is today, which is a little more of a drive yet going around. But we were driving home, and I was as emotional as I am right now, and struggling with tears, and said, I just don't think we need to look anymore. This doesn't where we belong, right? And so we would have that, and then someone would get up and they'll give the sermon. We have three ministers in our church, and so we tend to take turns, giving the message. But generally, it's going to be expositional, textual, topical kind of approach to the scripture. I think in Mennonite churches, there's a real sense that we're more focused on looking at what the Bible says and understanding what it says to us, and then applying that to our lives so we can lead this building in a way, live lives that point to Jesus Christ and honor Him and our faithfulness to Him. We don't always invest as much time in like knowing the ins and outs of different doctrinal positions on a question and things like that, or even knowing all of the names of what those positions are. That's something you'll find when you talk to at least the Mennonites that I'm familiar with.
So that's a good move into the next question. I was going to ask you, and I have a few questions here asking about like different positions on theology. But before any of that, you mentioned about like many Mennonites not knowing theological terms or the different positions and nuances of it. So what is there one view, and if there is, what is the Mennonite view on systematic theology? Is systematic theology a real thing to them, or is that very much to them a man-made concept pushed on the Bible? Like what would you say?
I would say it's complicated.
Okay, sure.
It's complicated because you have some who feel as though systematic theology can, in some ways, kind of take away from that's really probably like how we approach, in some ways, the word. Like, look at what it says, understand what it says, and then act upon that. And that's really kind of the impetus, I think, of a lot of how we interact with the word. And some folks would feel like the more systematic you become, or the more involved you become in trying to look at all the other things, it can take away from the simplicity of saying, this is what the Bible says, and this is what it calls us to do. But I think it's definitely, there's definite wisdom in knowing the whole counsel of God, and it's going to kind of vary from church to church, and even in our church, from preacher to preacher, as far as how involved they get. Yeah, I know in my preaching, I am one of the three ministers here. But in my preaching, I probably bring quite a bit of intentionality to trying to give a little bit of terminology or a little bit of frame of reference to contextualize, like, this passage of scripture. This is what we see, this is what we understand, this is what we feel like it calls us to do. But other folks, when they read this, they see this or they see that, and kind of give a little bit of a sense of understanding that there are other ways of looking at this.
So it sounds like what you're saying to me is that there is no document or confession that would make a stance either way on systematic theology, and so it's very much dependent on the church, right? Okay, gotcha. So with that shaky foundation, let me ask you what Mennonites believe about within systematic theology. So what is the general Mennonite soteriology? So I remember you and I were talking, and we were talking about the five solas of the Reformation, and you had brought up something like that Mennonites or Anabaptists may have an issue with the way the five solas are articulated. You said that's not so much the case for sola scriptura, but so when it comes to soteriology, what do they believe? I'm talking about like faith alone, grace alone, as it relates even to predestination, things like that.
Sure. Well, I think we do believe faith alone, grace alone. We believe that God He purposed that there would be a church, and that the church was going to be elect in Jesus Christ, and the church was going to be predestined to be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. We're, by and large, almost a dramatically overwhelming majority of Mennonites and Anabaptists in general are going to be free will.
Okay.
As far as their perspective.
Does that mean like Arminian or Provisionist or Molinist?
Yes.
Any of them?
You're going to find folks that probably you could throw out those terms and give them enough about those terms that they're comfortable with them.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably going to find, and again, I don't want to be disrespectful of anyone, but probably the majority, the average Mennonite you talk to, is not really going to know the larger differences between those positions.
Okay.
And things like, we've been going to this Mennonite church for most of the last 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
I have yet to hear prevenient grace mentioned once.
Okay.
I would say like the ins and outs of Arminianism, you're not really going to hear that.
Is there a belief on total depravity?
I don't know that there's not a universal position on total depravity.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that we very much strongly recognize that the scriptures talk about mankind as fallen.
Mm-hmm.
As far as again, all of the implications of total depravity, especially we're putting capital letters on that. You're probably going to be hard pressed to find a lot, as far as percentage wise, a lot of Mennonites. They're going to be really comfortable kind of walking through all of the implications of that.
Sure. So now I'm kind of taking a couple steps back here, but you talked about how like they often would not know those terms or being able to differentiate. Is that due to the way preaching is done, that there's less emphasis on the systematic nature of scripture, and in as much as I guess what I'm asking is there more emphasis on Christianity as what you do than Christianity as what you believe? Not to say that it's like a slight that okay. So
I understand. I think in a lot of ways it's really hard. It's hard to separate what we know from what we do, because I think we can only do as well as we know, in a lot of ways. But as far as how deep you go into those things, I think historically there's been more of a focus on, again, being very biblically based. But kind of like what Jesus says when he says, if you know these things in John 13, if you know these things, happy are you if you do them. That's probably a big part of Anabaptist culture and mindset, Mennonite mindset on that is being, I would say, more focused on faithfully living out what we know to do, than necessarily, going super deep in understanding theology and theological arguments.
Okay.
There reaches a point where do you know enough about this to act upon it?
Yeah.
And so I think there's a balance there, and definitely the majority of Mennonites that I know, and historically, if you look at history, there has been a strong focus more on living out our faith, than necessarily being super educated about a lot of things that aren't really the essentials of our faith, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So switching gears here a little bit, we talked about Mennonite ecclesiology to some extent being how the worship service is conducted. My understanding is it's sharing. Is the term what's the term? Sharing time or
It's sharing time?
Okay, sharing. So is it sharing time first, and then it's a sermon?
Yeah.
Or okay, is there anything else going on in the worship service? Like where does the taking part of the Lord's Supper come in? Like is that at the end?
We would have communion. Our church has communion twice a year, which feels like not enough for a lot of people, and it's actually less than I'm used to from my background.
Okay.
When we would observe communion, we would actually do communion and also a foot washing service. And so we would have a service devoted entirely to that and really revolving around that. And we would have an opportunity for folks to basically testify to their walk in the Lord, and to basically provide an opportunity for them to express their desire to commune. And then also then we would have a sermon about communion, partaking of the communion, a devotional talking about foot washing and almsgiving, and then of course, then we would have the foot washing service as well.
So in Mennonite theology, are there two sacraments / ordinances, or would we be including then foot washing and almsgiving?
Foot washing and I believe almsgiving would be considered ordinances.
Okay.
Not everyone who uses the word sacrament would mean it to be sacramental in the sense of it's an action that you do that imparts to you in some way saving grace.
Right.
But at least in my understanding, typically there's kind of this dividing line between treating it as something that's imparting you saving grace, or something that doesn't. It's treated as an ordinance. Even though you might call it a sacrament, essentially there's this dividing between something is happening or it's causing something to happen versus it means something. And so that's kind of, I think, the difference there. But there are 7 that.
There's 7. Okay.
And I have the list somewhere over here, but
okay.
Yeah, but things like marriage and communion and baptism.
Interesting. Okay. And then as it relates to the Lord's Supper, do you fence the table? Do you not fence the table?
When we first started attending here, they did what was called closed communion. And so with that, members would participate, and only members would participate.
Okay.
And it was a bit awkward.
So a person visiting.
As a visitor, or even, as somebody who had been attending here, wasn't yet a member, to not participate in communion was a bit awkward. Our church has actually, over the years, moved towards something I think people would describe as closed communion.
Yeah.
Open communion typically means like you're offering communion and anyone can walk in the door. We have had somebody do that before. People we didn't know from Adam. They walk in the back door during a service. They sit down. We're doing our thing, and they just hop up and participate in communion. With us. Yes, that was an exciting Sunday morning.
Yeah. So, I recently did a debate / conversation over the nature of the Lord's Supper, whether Christ is spiritually present in the Lord's Supper or not. What is the Mennonite belief on that? I know Zwingli, for example, was memorial.
Typically, memorialist would be probably the label that would get ascribed. And I can't speak for all Mennonite churches, obviously, because there's this whole spectrum thing.
This will be my last question on Mennonite ecclesiology. But what does the church government structure look like? Like how do you have elders, and if so, how are those elders appointed, and are these churches independent from each other? Like, talk about that.
Okay, that is a great question.
Yeah.
And I'll try to give a reasonably short answer to that. But Mennonite, there are Mennonite conferences. There are a number of Mennonite conferences, and there are some, again, on the more liberal end of the spectrum, probably they would call themselves denominations. Around here, there's actually a group that we're very familiar with because of their Bible school being, just half hour, 40 minutes up the road here. The Biblical Mennonite Alliance would be probably very similar to us, but we're actually an independent church. And so I don't know that our church is necessarily going to be like super representative of all those other churches. A lot of them are going to have, again, a central body that they would look to, and they would have bishops and things like that. They would have, kind of regional oversight or in the church a bishop. But in our church, we have 3 ministers. We're referred to as ministers, but essentially we're elders.
Okay.
We believe very strongly in a plurality of leaders. And that's something you're going to find pretty much amongst all Mennonites, to my knowledge, is you're going to find in Anabaptists in general, plurality of leadership. Another great book recommendation here, but Alexander Strauch has a book, Biblical Eldership. I think that really spells out really well the eldership model, which is very consistent with what Mennonites believe and practice about leadership.
Yeah,
having plurality of leadership.
And how are they appointed?
Well, we have ordination services for the ministers. We would have an ordination service, or in my case, I've actually I'd been ordained in other circles before it became to this Mennonite church, and so apparently in Mennonites and maybe Anabaptism, but once ordained, always ordained.
Okay,
they wouldn't have an ordination service for. They actually had a commissioning service for when I became a part.
So
I should say one more thing though, which might be dramatically different than a lot of the churches that your viewers would be familiar with. But in Mennonite churches, the men who are chosen to be in those leadership positions, including the ministers of the church, they're chosen from within the congregation in a Mennonite church, and I think places that practice what Alexander Strauch talks about, biblical eldership. There's a little bit more of a process where you're knowing those that labor among you. You're looking at these men that are in your midst, and you're evaluating them with the lists that are in the epistles about what those qualifications are, the character of Christ.
Right.
And you say, these men, they look like they're faithful followers of Jesus Christ. And so then those would be the men that would be chosen for those roles to be put into leadership. And so that's maybe a little bit different than folks are used to.
Is there a fixed Mennonite view on? I'm guessing probably not, but is like eschatology?
I was really surprised at how many Mennonites tend to lean amillennial.
Okay, yeah.
So I don't know for certain that it's necessarily the majority view, but if there is a majority view, I suspect it's probably amillennialism.
That's interesting. Do you think that comes out of the fact that many of the reformers would now all-mill, post-mill, pre-mill, very much modernistic terms, super implemented on past people. But as we look in history, like, you talk about the first Mennonite or Anabaptists come out of Zurich, Ulrich Zwingli, contemporary of Luther, very much amillennial in their eschatology, it seems. Do you think it's probably due to that?
I think that's fair. Yeah, that's probably quite a bit. And I know there are, I myself, I think I probably would consider myself a historic premillennial.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that's fair. It's probably a big reason for it. Yeah. I know a lot of the church world seems to think that dispensationalism is like the only view to have.
Oh, yes.
It's really only been around for, a little over 100 years now.
So what about, you brought up that you were Pentecostal before becoming Anabaptist. I assume that you yourself personally are still at least continuationist. Yeah. So what is the Mennonite view on that? Like, are they cessationists? Or even, again, understandably, maybe not everybody has that dogmatic confessional stance. But again, overall, what is the general consensus?
I honestly think if you're familiar with the Porteous book on miraculous gifts, it's a wonderful book on the different views. But they would talk about cessationists and open to cautious, Pentecostal or charismatic, and then what they call third wave. And so those would be the four views that were presented in that book. And I think probably if you were going in your average Mennonite church, you're going to probably find them generally are going to be in the open but cautious. Okay, is where they would fall.
Understand. Okay, so you brought this up before. This big emphasis on the teachings of Jesus, and especially now, what I've been able to understand is that let's take like Calvinists, for example. Like, what's the verse you think of or the chapter you associate with Calvinists? It's probably going to be Romans 9. When you talk about more Wesleyan tradition, I speak as Wesleyan in the more Nazarene style.
Sure.
Like, what's a chapter they would associate with? Probably something more to do with if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And now, as that then relates to Anabaptists, I would assume that the verse or the chapter or the section of scripture that is most held to dear is probably the Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah. So talk about that as like significant to your tradition.
Well, sure. I think if there's any passage that gets because almost like you said, almost every church group, they have their passages that they give special treatment to, a special priority to. And it's definitely for Anabaptists, it would be the Sermon on the Mount. I would say that the Sermon on the Mount is probably the heart song of Anabaptists. But you have this Jesus is giving these, and of course we got multiple chapters here, but he's giving this list of all of these teachings that really they turn everything on its head.
Yeah,
they go so counter to again our human nature and what we might think about. How we want to live and how what's right for me and what are my rights. And he says so many things about basically setting my rights and my wants aside for the sake of God's glory
Mhm.
and being a faithful representative of his kingdom. And there's so much there. And I know we don't have all the time in the world,
Mhm.
but I'll pull out one that probably a phrase that a lot of people are familiar with. It's in our common vernacular, but people talk about going the extra mile. Usually get going the extra mile like at work. We really like you to go the extra mile.
Yeah.
Right. But when Jesus talked about going the extra mile there in the Sermon on the Mount, he's talking to people who the Romans required the Jews that if a Roman soldier said to you, I want you to carry my pack, they had to pick it up and carry it for 1 mile.
Yeah.
They were required by the Romans to do that. And of course, if they didn't, bad things happen, right? But Jesus, he tells, if you're compelled to carry that burden for 1 mile, he says, take it a second mile.
Yeah.
Right? The King James says, go twain.
Yeah.
To take that second mile. And so what he calls us to, it isn't just, because most of the time, human nature being what it is, we tend to begrudge doing even what's required of us, things that we have to do. Sometimes we just really, we struggle to grumble a bit about having to do something that we don't want to do.
Right.
But Jesus, he says that we're supposed to not just do what we're forced to do because we have to do it, but to have such a heart that we would go and we would, of our own accord, take that thing that we don't really want to do, that we have to do, and do it again, just for the sake of showing them the heart of God towards us. And I think if you read through the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to find time and time again all of these things where he calls us to do more than the law requires, to do more than the Jews were used to seeing required there. And they had an awful lot of laws they were supposed to keep, and much was required of them. And yet he calls them to rise above even those things and do more for the sake of loving people the way Christ loves us.
Okay. So, I could see a person pushing back on that. So let me give you a pushback here, not necessarily from myself, but just from somebody. Some people would understand the Sermon on the Mount to not only be giving practical advice about how to live out your life as a Christian, but also to demonstrate how you just can't do it by Jesus elevating the law beyond what is possible for us to actually be able to do. So, for example, when he says, like, let your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, or you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Do you see room there for both, or would you say, like, no, like Jesus means that in a certain way that is attainable in this life?
I think he's setting for us a goal,
okay,
to shoot for, to strive for, and I think some of those things are hard. Some of those things are hard to wrap our minds around. But I think the various things that Jesus gave, that the Sermon on the Mount was essentially the Declaration of Independence for the United States. Like it's that message that comes out that is the declaration of his kingdom, and that is the type of behavior. That's the type of person that he's calling to his kingdom. And like you said, some of the things that are in there, well, even like you said the word perfect.
Yeah.
I think how we understand perfect sometimes can get us into trouble as well. But I think when he's calling us, that he's calling us to strive to fullness, to wholeness, to maturity in how we interact with people. And so, as reflective of, like he said, be holy for I am holy. It's a call to try to elevate ourselves in following him, to be more than just what Steve Grimm is on his own.
I see.
And to follow him, by his grace, by his power, to do those things that don't come natural for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So as we're wrapping up here, I'm going to go ahead and just ask you the last question. Okay. And it's, can you give me a brief apologetic, sorry for emphasizing brief, apologetic for why your denomination, or excuse me, not denomination, group,
sure,
the Mennonites, is more accurate to Scripture as opposed to others?
Well, if you wanted like super brief, I would probably go back to, if you know these things happen, you should do them.
You can be longer than that.
Yeah, but no, I think it kind of as I appreciate the humility that you really work with in your treatment of other Protestant groups. But I think there's a sense where it would be really unwise, I think, for us to sit here and act as though like we have some superior knowledge, or even some superior practice of our faithfulness and following Christ, and act as though other folks aren't as right or as good as us. I wouldn't dare make that kind of an argument.
Mhm.
I think, and I was actually debating and hoping maybe to share this, but there's a story I remember as reading as a fairly young man, child even maybe, called the Blind Man and the Elephant. If you're familiar with that,
Yes.
and I know the story has its own point to make, but in the story you have these blind men. They're surrounding this elephant, and they're all limited in their understanding of the elephant by what they are physically able to touch. And so the one that has is by the leg of the elephant is convinced that the elephant is like a tree, and the one that's by the side is convinced the elephant is a wall, the trunk a snake, and the tail a rope, and the story kind of goes on and on. As we kind of discussed earlier, each church, whether it's denominations and larger groups, or even churches within those larger groups, on each of those groups having something of a spectrum of where people fall. They have things that they're more keenly they have a better grasp on,
Mhm.
and they value those things, and they're so confident that they know that this is true, and it can skew perspectives and make you in some way think less of the one that's over there saying that the elephant is like a wall, when the elephant's like a rope because you got a hold of the tail, right? The danger is not so much in what we affirm, but in what we deny.
Yeah.
And I think it's really healthy for us to be humble enough and honest enough to take a step back and say, I understand my perspective. I understand what I really have a good grasp on, but maybe this group over here, God is so much, I'm not saying God is an elephant, because God is so much greater
Mhm.
than his creation. And so I think it's healthy for churches to, and individuals to be honest enough to say, hey, maybe I should engage in a conversation with folks.
Yeah.
And recognize the limitations of my understanding and my background and what I've been exposed to, and search the scriptures, because as it says, we're going to find Christ in the scriptures.
Mhm.
And I think that's the important thing. If you're asking why a person should look at a Mennonite church or an Anabaptist church and say, that might be a good fit for me, I really do think, to come back to that, I think the emphasis is on looking at what the scripture says and taking the things that aren't so hard to understand and trying to be very intentional and very consistent and living those things out in lives that give honor to Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
And I think if you're looking for something like that, a Mennonite church can be a wonderful place for you.
Okay, good deal. Well, I certainly learned a lot. I really appreciate you coming down and sitting with me, Steve.
Yeah.
And I thank you all so much for watching, and we'll go ahead and see you in the next one.